This is a Radical Exchange production. Hello, and welcome to Radical Exchanges. This is the second episode in our short series exploring the theme of what and how we own, building a politics of change. In our last episode, Matt Prewitt spoke with Margaret Levi of Stanford University about the work she and her team are doing as they rethink property rights to create a property system that prioritizes well-being, sustainability, and relational equality. In today's episode, the tables are turned, with Margaret interviewing Matt on his work in rethinking property rights. They begin by first discussing his views on the uneasy relationship between property and political liberalism. Then, they explore the mechanics of partial common ownership and why it fits with a better conception of liberalism. Radical Exchange is working with Margaret Levi and her team at Stanford, together with Dark Matter Labs, on exploring and reimagining the institutions of ownership. So without further ado, let's dive in with Margaret Levi and Matt Prewitt.
It's really a delight, Matt Prewitt, to have this conversation with you and to talk a little bit about this very interesting idea of partial common ownership and where it comes from. So what I'd like to do is really start, before we get to partial common ownership, to sort of understand what it's embedded in, what's the larger set of issues that are raised for you and that partial common ownership is partially a solution for. So I know that there are a couple of concerns that, as we've talked about these issues over time, are very, that you feel. One is that there is a problem with liberalism as we currently construe it. And another is your desire to achieve legitimacy in any kind of new institutional arrangement or problem solving that you engage in. So I'd like to spend a little time first just sort of parsing out some of those ideas, what you mean by liberalism, how that affects the property regime, what accounts for legitimacy, and then we can delve more deeply into partial common ownership itself. So why don't we start with liberalism? And maybe you could tell me a little more about what you mean by that term, where you see the problems lying, and we can go from there.
Sure. So I think that the place I'm coming from here is that I take a lot of the critiques of liberalism quite seriously. I think that there are pretty powerful arguments out there that that kind of demand a response from people committed to some sort of notion of liberal politics. And to me, the analysis of property rights and our conceptions of ownership are an important part of that. So that's kind of how the pieces fit together for me. Now, one point to make is that just on the topic of liberalism, even though I take a lot of these critiques of liberalism quite seriously, I also feel concerned that many of the sort of proposed alternatives to liberalism are either underbaked or utopian or dangerous or something like that. And to be clear, I actually think I do want to be clear that I sometimes think it's sort of unfair to push back against the critiques of liberalism by saying that the alternatives are dangerous. I don't think that that's always a fair way of sort of tarring the alternatives. Nonetheless, there's some truth to it. I remain committed to something that I think fits into the rubric of liberalism in an important sense. And I don't.
Can I push you for a minute, because I'm still not clear what you mean by liberalism. So, as you know, it's a term that gets used by all sides in our current contemporary political debates. Almost everybody claims to be a liberal, either in the classical sense which is sort of, the Adam Smithian sense of being a liberal, or as it's been understood by the neoclassicists and the neoliberals, or it's used as a sort of term for the progressives. So what do you mean? And when you say you're a liberal, what are you telling us? Or when you say you're against, you're critiquing liberalism, what are you critiquing?
So I think that so it's first important to distinguish, as you're suggesting, these kinds of parochial usages of liberalism. I don't just mean sort of progressivism in the American sense. I don't mean like the term liberal in European politics often means like sort of pro-market or something.
Right.
These are not the usages of liberalism that I have in mind. To me, the core of the concept of liberalism has to do with the constraint of power. Basically, it has to do with the idea that we want a certain relationship between authority and between the parties that are subject to the authority. I look to a couple of principles that Ronald Dworkin laid out as a pretty good guide to like the core of the concept of liberalism.
Ronald Dworkin, the philosopher, right?
Ronald Dworkin, the legal philosopher. He gives sort of two principles as the core of liberalism, which are both kind of directed at the sort of the problem of the legitimate use of coercive force by a government against its citizens. And the first principle, so I'll lay them out briefly, and then we can kind of talk about them more. I actually don't fully sign on to both of them, but I think it's a great place to start. The first principle is that coercive power is illegitimate if it is not motivated, if it is not guided by basically equal concern for all of the persons that are subject to the power, right? So this sort of criterion of equality or equal concern. And then the second principle is the idea that coercive power is illegitimate unless it respects the right and responsibility of every individual to decide for themselves what would count as success, what would count as a good life, what would count as the good. So to me, these two principles, which both have to do with the kind of with sort of constraining the exercise of coercive government power, are really the core of it. And these ideas are more abstract, and they cover most of the different sort of particular conceptions of liberalism that people talk about.
Great. Okay, so what is your critique of liberalism then, and how does property fit into that?
Well, so I think that liberalism. I'm not sure if it's a critique of liberalism or if it's critique of like a misconstrual of liberalism. But basically, I worry about how liberalism has been applied in practice, because I think that many governments and many societies that consider themselves liberal have sort of excessively relied on a few different kinds of institutions to like instantiate their commitment to liberalism. And one of the most important of those institutions is the institution of property, right? So the idea of private property kind of seems, to express these two principles because it has this sort of quality of neutrality, right? It has this quality of property rights themselves. It's kind of easy to make them formally apply equally to everyone in a polity, and property rights themselves also seem to kind of not put their thumb on the scale of any particular conception of the good. And you can make a similar statements, I think, about other sorts of economic institutions, such as money, right? Money also seems to have this kind of neutrality, this kind of quality of not respecting or favoring some groups over others, and not embodying any particular conception of the good. And therefore, I think that many thinkers who thought of themselves as liberal have understood these economic institutions like property and money as compatible with a liberal ordering of society. And that is the core of my worry. I also think there's another.
It's the core of your worry because you don't think of them as neutral. Is that?
It's the core of my worry because I actually think that that these institutions, it's not just that they're not neutral, it's more that they don't actually embody, these values. It's not, they don't express equal respect for everyone. They don't, and so what happens is basically the concentrations of power that form through these economic institutions end up themselves being sort of sites of illiberalism, right? They end up being nodes of illiberal power that are functioning in supposedly liberal societies. That's basically my worry.
And do you see those nodes of power as being, another term you use a lot is illegitimate or legitimate? So what would make those nodes of power either illegitimate or legitimate?
Well,
or does that term not apply to them?
When I talk about the way that I think about legitimacy is, I basically take legitimate to essentially just mean like justified power in the context of a legal ordering. So I have quite a general way of understanding legitimacy, but I think that liberalism is trying to ensure that power is legitimate, and I think that if we have kind of a better conception of what liberalism is trying to do or should be trying to do, then it suggests to us ways that we could reform these economic institutions that would better ensure the legitimacy of power operating in liberal societies. Does that make sense?
Not fully to me, because you've just defined legitimacy as having to do with the legal system, and that and property and money are both very much within the legal system as they are currently constituted, as legal systems are currently constituted. So it seems that by definition they're legitimate, but I'm hearing you worry that somehow they conflict with liberalism.
I see. I mean,
you would like to understand it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess we're getting tripped up on this sort of positivist sort of thing. Like in other words, I'm using legitimacy in a deeper way than just saying than for example legality. When I'm suggesting that power might be illegitimate, I'm not saying it's necessarily illegal. I'm saying that there might be some sort of moral problem with its ordering.
No, I would buy that, but that's the way you defined it earlier got us, I think, down this, verbally defined it, got us down this path a little bit. Okay, so liberalism may be a basis for legitimate power, but you feel like some of the institutions that have gotten embedded in it are problematic for that legitimacy and problematic for the state use of power. Is that?
That's right. And I think that in order to make them more legitimate, we need to have, we don't necessarily need to start here. This is all a little bit theoretical, but I think it helps to have a better conception of what liberalism is trying to do. And the way I understand that is, I view these sort of liberal principles as a way of ordering a society in which, either irreconcilable or very difficult to reconcile conflicts of value exist, but that can nonetheless function peacefully and stably and, to the maximum happiness of everyone, right? So I understand liberalism as playing kind of a mediating role. It's like a way of thinking about the coercive power or government power or whatever as sort of a mediator, and I think that we've gotten into I think a lot of 20th century liberalism kind of had a understanding of what such a mediator should be doing that I believe needs correction in order to reform these institutions.
Okay, so that leads us, I think, into some of the more concrete ideas you have about how to reform these institutions so that government can play more of a mediating role. And just so let me get one more piece of clarification out, Matt, if I may, which is that part of what I think I hear you arguing about the way in which property and money are embedded in liberalism currently is that they make for a kind of unequal playing field that then comes back and affects the way government can act, because it affects power within government, because part of what liberalism is also about, as I understand you, it has to do with a kind of democratic piece as well, that there's a popular piece of the accountability there. And if the population is very unequal or is unequal in ways that it can't be made relatively equal in political terms, even if it's unequal in economic terms, then there's a problem.
Yeah. The way I would put it is, I think that I think that liberalism in some ways has, well, let me put it this way. I think that one problem with liberalism is that I think that in many cases its principles have been sort of over-applied. So in other words, if you take these these liberal ideas about how power should be exercised, which were kind of originally sort of conceived as constraints on government power, and then you apply those same liberal principles outside of the sphere of government power, they can sort of erode or disrupt different kinds of associations in society. I think this kind of over-application of government principles has led to, or over-application of liberal principles has led to some backlash against the concept of liberalism. And then on the other hand, I think we often have like under-application of liberal principles. So there are sites of power in society that are not legitimate, that are morally objectionable, where we are tempted to apply liberal principles for perfectly good reasons. And what I want to suggest is that I think that there's a different sort of enemy that liberalism should understand itself as having. So liberalism, I think many liberals basically look throughout society and they look for examples of illiberalism, and they try to liberalize examples of illiberalism. And I think that what we should understand liberalism as doing is identifying certain kinds of illegitimate power and constraining those. And what I suggest as the sort of criterion for identifying that kind of illegitimate power is in this idea of like compounding power, of sort of geometrically, exponentially expanding power imbalances between different actors in society. And so this connects very closely to the idea of monopoly. I basically think that like monopoly power is, in a sense, the problem that liberalism is trying to solve. And I think that's a more precise way of understanding what liberalism should be trying to do than just saying, for example, liberalism is about the constraint of government power, of coercive government power. And I think that the reason that makes sense is because coercive government power is a classic example of a monopoly, right? The government uses its coercive power to prevent other actors throughout society from using coercive power amongst themselves, right? So it has this kind of compounding effect. Now, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that we do want to minimize the amount of coercion that's going on throughout society. But because you have this kind of process that has a potential to reinforce itself, coercive government power is dangerous. And like that's why liberal principles are a valuable guide upon it or a valuable constraint on it. So what I'm trying to do is suggest like a different sort of target for the application of liberal principles, which has to do with monopoly.
Okay, so that gets us into thinking about partial common ownership, because part of course, what drives radical exchange is a concern with creating a set of institutions that are not monopolies, but in fact are radically decentralized often, or certainly decentralized in terms of the distribution of power and accountability. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how one property has become a monopolistic problem, and then how partial common property ownership is a way around that.
Yeah. So property. The place to start here is just with the idea that private ownership of certain kinds of things amounts to a kind of compounding power, a power that has the potential to reinforce itself and grow exponentially. And as a consequence, because of that, that's my story basically for why certain kinds of economic power should be guided by liberal principles instead of just being assumed as legitimate or natural. So property often gives its owners a kind of power that has a political character that can't really be accurately understood as of a different kind than the coercive power that government has. So partial common ownership is a way of kind of reconceptualizing or redesigning property rights that tries to draw a clearer line between the kind of power that property rights, between the sort of political power that property rights give, and the non-compounding, less presumptively illegitimate sorts of economic power or power to steward assets or manage assets or resources, right? So it's about trying to distinguish between the monopolistic aspects of property and the non-monopolistic aspects of property.
Okay, so tell me precisely, as you can, what partial common ownership is.
Okay, so it's a way of rethinking the components of an ownership interest. The way that it works is as follows, right? So you might imagine. So let's imagine in the first case, just a traditional ownership interest over something like land. The way that if you made a partial common ownership interest attaching to that same asset, it would look different. Instead of being sort of one permanent interest, enabling its owner, giving its owner sort of permanent dominion over that land, the idea would be to split that asset into two separate assets. One of those assets is what you could call a partial common ownership license. The other, we'll call it a residual, and we'll get to that later. But a partial common ownership interest works as follows. It's an impermanent interest, but it's still an equity. It's still a kind of equity-like interest. The way that it works would be if I have a partial common ownership interest in land, what that enables me to do is that entitles me to act like the owner of the land for a fixed period of time. So it's a kind of a time delimited form of dominion.
But I take it it's different than the 99-year lease to British Homes or whatever.
Yeah. So the crucial difference is that at the end of that time delimited dominion, the asset goes up for auction. When it goes up for auction, the previous owner can participate in the auction and can bid on it. And if they win the auction, then if they put in a high bid, then they retain the asset. If they don't win it, then the asset goes to a new steward who then has, a sort of a subsequent partial common ownership interest in it. But the key twist here is that the winning bid for the asset from the new owner goes to the old owner. So in other words, if the value of the land increased during the time that I possessed it, then I proportionally benefit from that increase in its value, and vice versa if it goes down. Similarly, like if the prior owner of the land wins the auction, you can sort of think of them as they would have to pay the money to themselves. So no money has to change hands. They just hold on to it. But at the time of each auction, some percentage of that winning bid is taken as a fee, or sort of like a property tax, which then passes to the holder of the residual in the asset,
which is a second asset.
Which is a second asset. And I can talk a little bit more about how that residual works, but you can already sort of see the dynamic that there's the dynamic this is creating is where the license to use assets passes between owners, and it may fluctuate in value, and some portion of and there's basically a stream of taxes or payments on the asset that is constantly being generated and being passed back to the holder of the residual as the asset fluctuates.
Okay, let's make this even more concrete. So I know you've been doing some work with the Serpentine in London and with artists and with other owners of cultural property. And you've also been doing some work in Skowhegan, Maine. Maybe you could give us some concrete examples of how this works and who benefits and what the advantages of this system are.
Sure. So the idea is, well, here's a good example in the case of art. So let's say that an artist creates a work, could be like a tangible sculpture or something like that. If they wanted to create a partial common ownership interest, what they would do is, instead of just sort of selling the object, they would sell a partial common ownership interest in the object, which would then be, periodically put back onto the auction block, so that different owners would have the opportunity to acquire possession of it for temporary periods of time, ad infinitum.
Right.
So the asset will pass around between different stewards. Meanwhile, it will generate a stream of income that goes back to the residual. Now, the way to think about the residual, or the holder of the residual, and I think some of the interesting possibilities with this become clear here, is the idea is to make the residual something that is collectively held and potentially and either minimally or non-transferable. So in the case of an artist creating works, a good way of thinking about this would be like an artist collective. So let's say you have a group of artists who are all creating works of art. Maybe they're young artists, for example, and they don't really know if maybe one of their careers will take off and the other ones won't. Maybe some of the things that they create will end up becoming very financially valuable, and whereas most won't. Okay, so if everyone in the collective made their art available through partial common ownership interests, then you could imagine the collective being the holder of the residual for all of those interests in art. And so what that would mean is that the artist collective would receive a permanent stream of payments that are generated by these artistic assets that are put out there into the world. If some of them explode and become super valuable, then the lion's share of the benefits from that will be divided among the group of artists in the collective. And so what it's kind of like a social insurance scheme.
So it does raise a question, though, Matt, in any of these systems, which is inheritance. So it's clear that the person or persons who have to put the object or land or whatever up for auction, inheritance is irrelevant because it's a question of whoever bids for it at that time. But in terms of the residual, inheritance becomes an issue. So in the artist collective, does one of the artist's children then become a recipient of the residuals? Is there inheritance in this system?
I think that you could do it either way. I mean, it could be or it could not. I mean, all of these are sort of design questions that I think can
But
be.
inheritance is a very particular design issue when you think about the history of property, because that's often how cumulative advantage happens, right? You inherit something for which you have not put in any of the effort.
Yeah, I mean, one way of thinking about it, so if the residual of an artist's, if the holder of the residuals for a group of artworks is like an artist's collective, then it could be that those residuals are simply held by the collective, so that it would be up to the collective to work out the issues of inheritance as the next generation comes into being.
Or it could just belong to the collective and who's ever in the collective.
Exactly. Or it could just belong to
certain kinds of land or property ownership where there's collective ownership.
Yeah, and the whole idea of these kinds of residuals is to make them non-individual assets, right? Assets that don't attach to particular individuals, and so therefore it gets around sort of the problem of one person wanting to pass on their financial assets to the next generation. I mean, if these residuals are sort of permanent kind of assets, and the idea is that they should be held not by individuals but by institutions or by networks or by other kinds of non-individual entities. So I've also done a lot of thinking about how, for example, trusts could hold residuals and then pursue like a particular kind of mission for the for how to use the
Well,
return.
there are many examples of land trusts where that kind of process occurs.
Right.
Not partial common ownership, but the residual piece.
Yeah, exactly. So there are institutions that exist that are capable of handling this kind of a problem, and yeah.
One of the things that I'm curious about is, there are resonances in this, not surprisingly, to the book by Glenn Weil and Richard Posner on radical markets, and they're
Right.
but this is different, right? So how is it different? Maybe you could explain that a little bit.
Yeah, so that book did a really nice job laying out the basic mechanism design idea upon which this work is based. But there are a lot of details in the way that it's exposited in that book that I think are impractical or that just aren't necessarily useful for the kind of work that I'm doing now, which is trying to build practical institutions that are able to use, to gain some of the possible benefits of a system like this. So I'll name a few of them. So in that book, the idea of partial common ownership is primarily depicted as a continuous auction. So in other words, an auction that is constantly ongoing, so that anyone can get outbid at any time. That's actually a very good way of illustrating theoretically the power of this mechanism, but it's impractical because for many kinds of assets, people need a certain degree of security in possession over a certain amount of time to be able to practically make use of something. Another important difference is that in that book sort of proposes that partial common ownership could be effectuated through changes in property tax regimes, which I think is an interesting idea, and I don't totally rule out that there are possible ways that this idea could improve property tax regimes. But I don't think that you can really convert legal ownership interests into partial common ownership interests through a tax regime, through a change in a property tax regime, without, for example, triggering the takings clause. So, so I think that the more salient, more practical ways of moving this idea forward go through other channels than that. It has more to do with setting up ways for communities to use partial common ownership to share power over common assets.
So can you tell me how this improves upon common ownership? Common property ownership? I mean, why partial common as opposed to common?
Sure. So in a way, what it's doing is splitting a false dichotomy that I think has impeded people's creativity in imagining new ownership relations. And that false dichotomy has to do with the idea that, like, if we want to distribute ownership over assets, like the most, one way of doing that is to split the asset into many different pieces, and essentially give everyone little fractional shares of a particular asset. And another way of doing it is to consolidate the absolute dominion over the asset in one institution, and then kind of put faith in the ability of that institution to represent the collective interests. I think that both of those means of dividing power over assets have problems. They basically both run into the same sort of coordination problem. If we take an asset like if we take an indivisible asset like a sculpture or something like that, it's a bit weird to imagine lots of people owning little different shares of it, right? Because then what we're doing is we're kind of just financializing it. We're not resolving the question about, who gets to put it in their museum or who gets to display it in their living room. And we're kind of, potentially inviting complex coordination problems and collective decision problems between the many different owners of all of the fractions of the asset. Then on the other hand, if we give the asset to the government, let's say, and then assume that the government is an accurate representative of the common interest, then to whatever extent the government is dysfunctional, or to whatever extent the government is not actually able to embody or represent the collective interest, we haven't really done what we've wanted to do. So what partial common ownership does is it retains this kind of feature of assigning an economic actor the ability to manage the asset, to steward the asset, to possess the asset, to act like the owner of the asset, and to fulfill many of the functions that, in an ideal sense, asset owners fulfill, without giving that individual owner excessive or unnecessarily permanent power over the asset.
Got it. But so would you see this partial common ownership as replacing common property in places where there are literally commons? The Elinor Ostrom kind of?
No.
Is this an alternative or, a complement to that?
No, I think it's a complement to that, because there are lots of examples of assets that are held in common, or that are managed by some representative of a shared interest, that just work fine.
Yeah.
And partial common ownership, properly understood, properly applied, partial common ownership should not seek to change that, right? So a good example is like a park, right?
Yeah. No, I was thinking about parks, and I was thinking about grazing areas.
Yeah, right. So there's no reason to partial common ownership. There's no reason to use partial common ownership to change the way that parks are owned, because parks work well. So when we have collective institutions that work well, when we have commonsing arrangements that work well, this is solving a problem that we don't have. Where this is interesting is where the sort of mentality of private ownership is overapplied, and where our sort of lack of creativity in imagining alternatives to individual private ownership kind of demands demands an alternative, or we can do better.
Okay, that leads into my last question, which is, one of the things that this conference is really about is the politics of change. So how does this all feed into, and what is your theory of change here?
My theory of change is that, I think that there are many examples in history of a kind of a lack of creativity preventing us from doing more to vindicate the common good. And I think that we're in one of those moments where we have kind of so fetishized the the efficiency and the justice and the legitimacy of private property arrangements, that we just aren't seeing different ways of doing it. I think that by experimenting with this particular way, now I think that this is a different way of doing it that I think is uniquely powerful, uniquely interesting, serves as kind of a template for building different kinds of ownership arrangements that do things that other kinds of commonsing arrangements don't do. And I think that when we get more experiments with it, when we build more of a critical mass of people and institutional actors who kind of get this idea and who are able to put it into practice in their in their work, in their institutions, whether those are artists' collectives or land trusts or data coalitions or whatever it may be. There's lots of different sort of domains of application. But when we start to build a critical mass of people who deeply understand this idea and are committed to experimenting with it and building on this as a template for better ownership arrangements, we will start to see more a broader understanding of it. We'll start to see some of these arrangements work well. It will inspire other examples. It will inspire governments to think about, maybe we can do better than just sort of, selling the city land to the highest bidder, right? Maybe we can set up a different kind of arrangement. So I think that my theory of change is that my theory of change, I can't find the right word, but my theory of change is that this is a better toaster oven. And then when people see that it's a better toaster oven, more institutional actors and organizations that are in position to serve the common good will be inspired to take it up, and it'll change the way we think about property.
Let's hope you're right. Lovely. Well, thank you, Matt. That was a great conversation.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thanks again to Margaret Levi and Matt Prewitt. The Radical Exchanges podcast is executive produced by G. Angela Corpus and Matt Prewitt, and is co-produced and audio engineered by myself, Aaron Benavides. This episode was produced and recorded by Matt Prewitt. If you would like to learn more about Radical Exchange, please follow us on Twitter at RadicalxChange or check out our website at radicalxchange.org. And if you'd like to join in the conversation, we'd love to hear from you. So hop on our Discord, where we have channels discussing topics like what you heard today, as well as topics like plural voting, community currencies, soulbound tokens, and more. There will be links for all of these in the description. Have a great day and stay radical.